Welcome to our presentation on cholera epidemics of the long 19th century. We are Àlex, Albero, Emilia, Rojo, Felipe, Sara, and Sara, Lodes, and we are going to introduce you into what is cholera, how it has epidemically affected our societies, and which advances have the outbreaks catapulted us to, and how epidemics change the course of action of societies. Cholera is a bacterial infection of the small intestine that quickly leads to acute diarrheal disease, with symptoms of watery diarrhea that cause severe dehydration, resulting in cold skin, lost skin elasticity, and wrinkling of the extremities in just a few hours if untreated. Today we know that the illness is waterborne thanks to the studies of John Snow, who pioneered investigations on cholera epidemics. And now we know that the key transmission is generated by mainly unsafe water and food contaminated with human feces, containing the bacteria. We, humans, are the only ones affected, with risk factors including lacking sanitation and lack of clean drinking water. The majority of cases go underreported. This is attributed to a lack of epidemiological surveillance and the lack of use of laboratories. Additionally, the use of economic and political dynamics to help reporting of the cases. Nowadays, the cases are analyzed with the help of supranational cooperation to overcome data research obstacles. Now there is a spatial modeling technique in endemic countries to update estimates and alert. Countries are categorized by cholera endemic, cholera non-endemic, or cholera-free via spatial regression, and incidences are analyzed for 5 years. The results are published in the WER, the Weekly Epidemiological Report. A simple epidemiological analysis will tell us that it affects from 1.3 to 4 million people worldwide, causing around 21,000 to 143,000 deaths per year in the developing world, and a 2 to 5 million estimated for the globe. As with many other epidemics, cases go underreported, especially in regions with difficult access or lacking resources. And although much is known about the cholera, how to treat it, and how to avoid it, we still cannot understand why does the outbreak happen in select places. The disease started with the spreading through trade routes to Russia, around 1 million deaths in the 1817, and later to the rest of Europe, also adding the movement of military forces to the shores of the Indian Ocean, from Africa to Indonesia, and north of China, from Africa to Indonesia, and north of China and Japan. In the past, vessels near the port would tag a yellow quarantine flag to their masts if any crew members or passengers were suffering from cholera. The passengers would not be allowed ashore, usually for 30 or 40 days. We can see this in novels such as El amor en los tiempos del cólera from Gabriel García Márquez, in which the passengers would not be allowed ashore for any reason during the quarantine.
Cholera began posing a potential global problem with the movement of people and commodities across borders. Trade, migration, and military events contributed to the spread around the globe. The fear caused by the violence of the disease, as well as the already present tensions in many cases, political, economic, and social ones, made the social impact much more severe. Uncertainty surrounding the disease also played a huge role in the development of the pandemics.
For hundreds of years, it had been known that cholera existed in the Bay of Bengal region of India. There are several accounts of cholera-like symptoms going as far back as the 6th century BCE. The first pandemic, however, began in 1817. It killed approximately 1 to 2 million people and led to the creation of medical administrations, increased authoritarianism, and increased xenophobia towards Asia. Many scholars believe that its spread initiated through Hindu pilgrimage, in which bathing ceremonies would take place in the Ganges River. The pilgrims then traveled to Calcutta. From there, it spread through Asia and the African coast via trade routes and soldiers who were infected during the Ottoman-Persian War. When it reached Russia, Tsar Alexander I would establish Russia's first medical administration board. It's also important to mention the role of empire, which shaped the history of cholera. The historian William Hardy McNeill once said that the British played an important role as well, since the British Army carried the disease by land to Afghanistan and Nepal, while British Navy and merchant ships carried it beyond the Indian Ocean. This would also lead to an increased dissemination of the illness during the second pandemic.
The origin of the second cholera pandemic was Bengal, northeast India, the same as the first outbreak. Caravan routes spread the disease into Afghanistan and further into Russia and Iran in the late 1820s. Russian soldiers brought the disease to Poland in 1831, and the spread sped up to reach Hungary, Germany, Finland, Sweden, Austria. Cholera made it into England, Scotland and Wales in the same year, as well as Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands and France in 1832. Irish immigrants spread the disease into Canada and the US, to then be further brought into Cuba and Mexico in 1833. In the same year, an English ship brought the disease to Portugal and subsequently to Spain as well. Cholera was then spread through Catalonia into France and Italy. The disease was also spreading in another direction. Mecca was infected too, with pilgrims playing a very central role. Ethiopia, Zanzibar, and other North African territories began to be infected too. In Europe and the West, as well as in Russia, the main measures taken against the spread of cholera were quarantines, sanitary cordons, health boards, attempts to clean up areas, and isolation. Many European societies at the time were living in political, economic, and social tensions, so many measures were rejected by the populations. In Russia, the so-known cholera riots proved just how severe the social impact of the disease was, as working-class riots began emerging in the country. Expert opinions regarding the causes of the disease were highly contested. In Western Europe, contagion, environmental causes, inflammation of the gastric tract, failure of the circulatory system were just some of the main discussed issues. The poor were also seen as dangerous in the sense of being potentially contagious. In the US, the spread was often associated with Irish immigrants and African Americans, and in Britain, even religious arguments were discussed.
The third pandemic occurs between 1846 and 1860. Researchers tend to support the theory that it originated in Bengal, India, by the movement of travelers and troops to Iran, Iraq, Arabia, and Russia. This outbreak is key to the analysis of cholera, not only because of the high numbers of fatalities and devastation that it brought to the cities, but because in 1854 a British physician called John Snow mapped the cases of cholera to discover that cases clustered around the pump. The only building without a single case had a private water pump. The feces were leaking to the water system through unconventional pipe systems, and the bacteria was breeding in water, causing the water to taste sweeter. The first double-blind experiment for cholera was created with the map and the empirical investigation of John Snow, and the research in this third outbreak was far from saving lives. In the US, researchers thought cholera had some kind of association with African Americans, when the real association was in the underlying causes that kept them from sanitation and healthcare resources. Hence, the discovery of Snow slowly made its way to the actual practice.
What we can call the fourth cholera pandemic, which ran from 1863 to 1875, again began in the Ganges River Delta and migrated with religious pilgrims to the Middle East and from there across Europe and Africa. The US was in the middle of a civil war at the time, making it particularly vulnerable to outbreaks while the government's focus was elsewhere. Sewer and water systems had not yet developed to accommodate industrializing cities, and cholera decimated worker populations in many outbreaks over the decade.
Alright guys, so just 6 years later, during 1881 through 1896, the fifth outbreak of cholera took place. For the next 15 years, this pandemic would be considered to be less severe than the previous ones, although it claimed 250,000 lives in Europe and at least 50,000 lives in the Americas. With this, it was also widely spread throughout Asia and Africa. The fifth pandemic of cholera was a turning point for many nations. For example, in 1883, when in Hamburg, 8,600 people died. As a result, the fear drove citizens to hold authorities accountable and riot for answers. With the driving force being feared towards these outbreaks, cities began shifting towards better sanitation and water systems. Without this shift in mentality during the fifth outbreak, there wouldn't have been such a strict demand for safer water systems.
In his 2014 book titled The Transformation of the World, Osterhammel stated that any disease has a distinctive chronology that differs according to location. Cholera also had its own distinctive chronology. In Europe, the peak of the spread happened during the mid-1800s and was soon after eradicated. Over a century later, South America would experience its very own outbreaks of the disease, with over 158,000 cases arising in only the first 3 months in Peru alone. Here we see a clear example in which not only the spatial context of a disease matters, but also its temporal context. The outbreaks of cholera in Europe during the 19th century served to awaken the public with regard to the need for proper sanitation systems, sewage treatment, and clean water. This awakening did not happen in many parts of Latin America until the outbreak of cholera there in the 90s. Slum dwellings were hit hard due to their lack of sanitation system and infrastructure to combat the spread of the disease. During the Peruvian outbreak in 1991, the Rio Rimac was often compared to the Thames River during the Great Stink of the 1800s.
During the age of cholera, differences were not only felt between different regions or between the countryside and urban centers, but across different urban centers as well. London and Paris experienced the cholera pandemics very differently due to the fact that London industrialized at a much greater pace, but both were still severely hit. In London, industrialization led to overcrowding caused by huge increases in population and poor sanitary conditions that made the spread of cholera much more likely than in Paris, where some people even fled to the countryside and the effects of industrialization didn't have such relevance. In both cases, the cholera pandemics resulted in the construction of new sewage systems that certainly proved to be effective, and in some cases are still in use today. In Paris, wider streets and more spacious neighborhoods also helped improve the sanitary conditions in general terms. Before becoming a pandemic, cholera was endemic in India. Two fundamental factors of 19th century life defined the way the disease spread: the spread of Western military and colonial power, and improvement in the speed of world traffic. In the first years of the pandemic, pilgrimage, the movements of soldiers and sailors, and seaborne trade were main causes of the spread. In later years, from the mid-1800s on, the speed of this world traffic was improved by increased openness and trade, and investment in railroads and steamboat transportation that made movements of both people and commodities more frequent and faster, causing the spread to gain even more momentum too. At the same time, long-lasting uncertainty surrounding the causes of the disease until the mid and late 19th century gave it more room for expansion until medical experts began to be able to approach it properly. It's important to note that during the winters, pandemics seemed to slow down, only to speed up again afterwards, and droughts created the perfect conditions for the disease to spread at higher rates.
Pandemics such as cholera force societies to acknowledge and grapple with several inherent structures, particularly a society's relationship to its environment and individuals' relationships to each other. Diseases exploit the divisions within societal structure. Still today, we can see the obvious contrast between the economic class of communities afflicted with cholera and those who have never even considered it as a danger. How a government reacts to an outbreak of disease is often an indicator of how much value they place on the lives of the poor. Very often, responses to a disease outbreak involve heavy restrictions of civil liberties. However, especially in Western countries where freedom and individuality are emphasized, these intense restrictions can alienate people from their government, which restricts the flow of information. And information is key in halting the pandemic. This is the difficult balance that governments must try to strike. Britain's response to outbreaks in the 19th century demonstrates many common characteristics of government and societal responses. We can see today's same economic arguments against national lockdowns dating back to the 1830s, when British merchants were outraged about their government's tentative plans to quarantine ships arriving from the Baltic Sea. We can also see several of the same conspiracy theories circulating. Parliamentary reform, which would benefit masses of new city dwellers, was a hot-button topic of the 1830s Britain. And many believed that the new hysteria about cholera was only a ploy to distract the public from other more important issues.
When it comes down to how political representatives, health practitioners, and people on the front lines of care experience epidemics, it's vital to see how they are pushed to make groundbreaking discoveries in the medical and scientific field. Those practicing medicine were pushed to do new research and uncover the answers behind the spread of cholera. In the UK, for example, in 1848, the government set up the Board of Health, which prioritized cleaning up the streets as well as building sewers throughout the city. Along with this, in 1875, the Public Health Act enforced responsibility to keep streets, sewers, and water supplies healthy and clean. Namely, German microbiologist Robert Koch in 1883 founded modern bacteriology and studied cholera in Egypt. Through his research, he was able to conclude and describe the bacteria that attacked the intestines. Also mentioning John Snow, an English physician and developer of medical hygiene who, as said earlier, played a huge role in finding the source of an outbreak in 1854. He was able to uncover the outbreak was spreading due to a contaminated water pump in London and pushed for better sanitation. From his discovery, people were able to better understand that cholera was spread through water. The frontline workers didn't have the choice to back away, and instead were forced to discover new advancements in the medical and scientific field during this epidemic.
How can history inform the public understanding of the quest for solutions on the road ahead? Epidemics start at a moment in time, proceed on a stage limited in space and duration, following a plot line of increasing revelatory tension, move to a crisis of individual and collective character, then drift toward closure. So this quote by Charles Rosenberg in his book Explaining Epidemics is very indicative of the nature of pandemics. The revelatory tensions he speaks of bolstered a variety of initiatives to eradicate illnesses. When faced with the spread of a disease and sweeping mortality with very few options to combat it or effective treatments to cure it, medical as well as social and political experimentation is fomented. During past outbreaks, such as that of cholera in the long 19th century, new vaccines, treatments, surveillance practices, and theories emerged, some which we still use today, and others which we now know are false and irrelevant. There were quite a few revelatory advances in the field of medicine during the cholera pandemics of the 19th century. Scientific advances include the use of contact tracing by John Snow, who is often deemed the father of modern epidemiology. Robert Koch was the first to gain recognition for discovering the bacterial strain which spread the cholera virus, proving that microbes were the cause of the illness. And also medical boards were established in some countries for the first time ever. It is important to note, however, that cholera continues to plague many poor countries today, so it has not been eradicated in its entirety. Most historians agree that cholera was eradicated from Western countries via public health reforms, the discovery of new medicines, and international cooperation. We still see this formula being used today with the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. Many public health reforms took place during the cholera pandemic. Like most pandemics, including the one we're experiencing today, they require a centralized health system to combat the disease. New medicines were discovered, including some vaccines which would halt the spread of the bacteria during the latter part of the century. The third cholera pandemic, which hit Europe the hardest, incited the first true effort towards international cooperation against the disease. In 1852, the French government called for an international meeting to standardize protective measures against the importation of disease. This is the first example of international health cooperation and would eventually lead to the creation of the World Health Organization. Again, when I say international cooperation, this term often excludes the poor countries which continue to be plagued today. In conclusion, cholera was a powerful social actor since it altered the social, political, and economic landscape of the 19th century. Cholera did not and continues to not affect every place and every society in the same way. It was mostly eradicated from Western countries during the third pandemic, so it's not given much importance nowadays. However, it does continue to plague many countries. Past epidemics like cholera help us understand how to cope with such crises today, and we often use many of the same techniques to combat disease. However, we do sometimes continue to make the same mistakes. COVID-19 is a recent and pertinent example of how regional disparities continue to arise. Many richer countries began to hoard protective equipment, leaving poorer countries more vulnerable to infection. Thank you.